Okay, so there's this channel called Russel brand and it's been requested quite a bit from you guys. He makes a lot of videos on the situation of the world, such as COVID or the war in Ukraine right now, but he's a bit of a conspiracy theorist and shares a lot of false information. You know, the usual idiot on the internet. You see one, you've seen them all. What really boggles my mind is how he can make these videos spreading false information but get so many views out of it. I've literally never seen anything like it. The YouTube algorithm is just crazy. This guy makes a living out of deceiving people. Is that really a profession that should exist in this world? Anyway, this is the first but definitely not the last time I'll be making a video on this guy. Let's have a look.
With a series of studies showing the effectiveness of natural immunity, is it time for us to redefine the term fully vaccinated?
Oh really? Has there been a lot of studies surfacing recently that shows the power of natural immunity? Don't get me wrong, natural immunity is powerful. It's kept us alive for as long as human beings have been around and is able to adapt to literally any disease possible, including ones that don't exist yet. When we compare vaccines to natural immunity, we're not insinuating that natural immunity is bad. It's not. Just that vaccines are usually better. And of course, you can have some garbage vaccines out there, but we wouldn't use those ineffective ones. It's the best vaccines that make it into the market, and the COVID vaccines are no exception. We got lucky that Pfizer and Moderna are pretty darn good, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep developing more vaccines, because you can easily get better and cheaper ones as more research is done. It's an ongoing process.
Now, today I want to talk to you about natural immunity. You will have noticed over the course of the last couple of years that there are points where it's impossible to talk about a certain subject, and then over time, the conversation changes. This you'll have noticed in areas around vaccination, vaccine mandates, Wuhan lab leak theory, mask efficiency and efficacy.
What? These topics were never eggshells. You can talk about them whenever you want. We as scientists talk about them all the time. The difference is when you spread misinformation regarding one of those topics, and it can cause real harm to the world. For example, if you tell people not to vaccinate or claim that masks are ineffective, you are indirectly contributing to the spread and possibly mutations of COVID-19. If you spread false claims about the Wuhan lab, which has been debunked since the beginning of the pandemic, you're doing nothing but spreading hate and blame to a group of people. And again, social media has made it so easy for you to talk about anything you want that it's not a restriction to your free speech at all. You're not walking on eggshells.
And today we're talking about natural immunity. This still has to be discussed with a great deal of caution, and I want to make very, very clear to you indeed that I have no opinion at all about what you should do for your health and the health of your family. I'm simply interested in us looking at information together and sensibly and responsibly coming to conclusions based on scientific information.
So Russell says this a lot, that he doesn't have an opinion, nor is he giving you his opinion, and that you should come to your own conclusions based off the information that he presents. But that's not how it works. If you're spreading propaganda on one side and omitting the other side, you're actively taking a side even if you're not giving your own opinion. Like if there was a debate as to which food is better, I don't know, broccoli vs cookies, and then if I gave my audience only articles on why cookies are better and more nutritious, that's me taking a side. If you don't present information honestly as is and instead choose and pick which information to present, especially if that information is wrong as we're about to see in this video, then you're actively giving your opinion even if you don't outright state it. And it's clear which side Russell actually stands, as his videos are full of conspiracy theories and nonsense information which he feeds to his audience, who gobbles it up whole.
This is Eric Topol, founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute.
Immediately I can tell something is fishy because Russell decides to present a secondary article written by someone who isn't a scientist. Why can't people just read actual primary articles? If you want to get the information at its rawest form directly from the scientists who conducted the research, why not read the papers that they themselves have written? Why read someone's potentially faulty interpretation of such science? Because, as we've seen many times already, uneducated people are turning COVID-19 into a political issue, which it shouldn't be. So many articles are charged with political narrative. Instead, why don't we turn the ship back around into the realms of science and read the studies for what they are?
The US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has failed to recognize that people with confirmed COVID infections, also known as natural immunity, have achieved some level of protection against subsequent infections and severe disease.
No, the CDC did not fail to recognize the power of natural immunity. Again, natural immunity is powerful, but you have to evaluate each situation on its own, and when we compare them to vaccinated immunity for COVID-19, the body of evidence shows that they are lacking behind. I made a video on this earlier, but I'll briefly reiterate what I said there. It makes makes sense that vaccinated immunity would have better efficacy because we are able to pick and choose which parts of the virus to target specifically. When you get an infection, the body doesn't know which part of the virus is the most potent, and rather would produce an adaptive immune response that targets the entire virus. Meanwhile, us human beings, knowing from science that the spike protein is the most important one because it is responsible for attaching and entering the cells of our body, targeting that would be more efficacious than targeting, for example, some random peptide sequences found on the virus's envelope. So when you get natural immunity, you get antibodies that target the entire virus. When you get vaccinated immunity, you get antibodies that target specifically the spike protein. That's why vaccines for viruses can generally be more effective than natural immunity, and that's the case we see for COVID-19. Of course, just because science gives us that assumption to begin with doesn't mean it behaves like that practically, which is why we have multiple studies showing over and over again that vaccinated immunity against COVID-19 is better. More on this later.
This has unnecessarily fueled divisiveness, particularly when vaccines are mandated without acknowledgement that prior COVID is an alternate path, albeit with some limitations, for protection of the individual and helping to build the population's immunity wall.
It's counterintuitive to build up an immunity based off natural immunity. Don't get me wrong, it does play a role, but ultimately vaccines are the best way to build up an immune defense for a population. And the reason for that is because in order to achieve natural immunity, you have to get sick first, and that completely defeats the point. And when more people get sick, the higher the chances of mutations and new variants, and then we're essentially back to square one. Because COVID mutates so quickly, we cannot achieve herd immunity just by infecting people and using natural immunity. Not only does that open the doors to more mutations, it would also be like toughening your body by repeatedly punching yourself. Would you rather be resistant to getting beat up by beating up yourself first and getting thicker skin, or would you rather grab a shield and put on some armor?
While there has been a body of data supporting a robust immune response to COVID infections, that evidence has recently been substantially bolstered.
Huh? We must live in different universes. Sure, vaccine efficacy goes down after a period of time, but that's the case for pretty much any disease. There are some that lasts a long time or a lifetime, but we shouldn't expect that from natural or vaccinated immunity.
In the very large trial on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine single shot compared with placebo, among over 2,000 participants with prior infections as documented by positive antibody status, their protection against moderate or severe disease was 90%. So, people that had previously had the infection had 90% immunity. That's very effective. We will perhaps see over the course of the article whether it's more effective than one vaccine or two vaccines with boosters. Because remember, we're not saying or offering an opinion along the lines of, oh, this is better or that's better. We're just looking at this information and then you can see what you think. That's much higher than the vaccine efficacy of 56%.
That sentence doesn't say anything other than the participants had a positive antibody status before, which can come from either the vaccines or previous infection. That's where you have to be careful. A positive titer test does not mean you had COVID before, because vaccines easily produce that result as well. That being said, I'm not interested in picking out the wording of whoever this is that wrote a secondary article on natural immunity, so like any sensible scientist, I'm going to go into the primary source and see what the authors of the original paper had to say. We'll take a look at the secondary article on the way. Why one shot after a COVID-19 infection should suffice to be considered fully vaccinated. Okay, so that's not actually an extreme position to take actually, because they're saying that you should still get vaccinated, just only one shot if you've had prior positive infection, which I can kind of see but also disagree with. In fact, when vaccines first came out, we thought about this question a lot regarding how many doses to give to people who had COVID before, if at all, so that we can save more shots for people who are not infected. But again, studies have shown that because how much weaker natural immunity is, experts still recommend that people who were infected before should still get vaccinated. I thought that was an old debate, but since this article was written in February this year, I guess we're revisiting it. However, this time I doubt it has to do with the issue of vaccine shortages, but rather just because this guy doesn't want to vaccinate and is probably a right-wing conspiracy theorist trying to push his propaganda. Let's go on. So the article actually links to the primary sources, which makes my job a lot easier, so let's click on this J&J study that Russell just read about. We'll just take a look quickly at the important parts of the abstract for now. The AD26-CoV-2S vaccine was highly effective against severe to critical coronavirus disease 2019, hospitalization, and death in the primary phase 3 efficacy analysis. A single dose of AD26-CoV-2S provided 52.9% protection against moderate to severe critical COVID-19. Protection varied according to variant. Higher protection was observed against severe COVID-19, medical intervention, and death than against other endpoints and lasted for 6 months or longer. So immediately, I don't see where the other secondary article got the numbers from. I've looked around the entire primary paper and couldn't find where they even mentioned a 90% efficacy for people who had a previous positive antibody result. And the 56% seems a little too different from the 52.9% presented in the original paper to make me believe that they pulled this number from the paper. Not to mention that the entire claim seems to be forged. Nowhere did they even look at participants with a previous positive antibody test. Nowhere did they have 2,000 of those participants. Instead, the study focused on looking at people who had the J&J vaccine and compared it to the placebo to determine efficacy against infection, hospitalization, and severe disease. The conclusion is 52.9% with plus or minus depending on the variant for moderate to severe critical COVID-19, and about 52.4% for symptomatic COVID-19. It doesn't even attempt to say anything about natural immunity. The only thing that was even relevant to that was the fact that a placebo is used, which judging by the efficacy conclusions means that the placebo was lower, which of course it is. The takeaway from this paper says this: overall, our findings indicate that a single dose of AD26-CoV-2S provided protection against severe disease and hospitalization, which could be important to regions requiring mass vaccination or in populations with poor adherence to 2-dose prime regimens, and support the use of AD26-CoV-2S in the ongoing effort against the global COVID-19 pandemic. This would actually somewhat support the title of the secondary article we read earlier because it was supporting a 1-dose vaccine, specifically after prior infection. But the study says differently and makes no claims on prior infections. Meanwhile, Russell, you've completely misrepresented the secondary article you're quoting, which in turn itself is also misrepresenting the conclusions of the primary paper. This is just a gross game of telephone. By the way, did I mention that the secondary article was written on February 20th and the paper it's quoting was published on March 3rd?
So I suppose the reason that would become relevant is, for example, if you have a vaccine passport or green card or digital ID situation that allows you to travel if you've had a vaccine but doesn't allow you to travel if you have natural immunity, according to that data, that would be illogical, wouldn't it, I suppose?
It would, if the paper actually said what you claimed it said.
Yet the CDC recognises 2 shots of this vaccine as fully vaccinated, but ignores these data and many other proof points of natural immunity protection. So it's saying that the US Centre of Disease Control perhaps needs to amend its assessment of what constitutes full vaccination. If by full vaccination you mean protected from carrying, transmitting, or being infected by coronavirus.
There is no perfect scientific organization, but the CDC in general, just like the FDA or WHO, are pretty darn reliable. There are so many papers out there that have compared natural to vaccinated immunity, and the conclusion is quite unanimous that vaccinated immunity has better efficacy. That being said, results will differ depending on which vaccine you take and how long afterwards you measure. But you not showing us the magnitude of these other papers goes to show that you're letting your opinion through into your videos even if you claim you're not. Choosing what to show makes a huge difference on your message of your video. The paper that was quoted didn't even support your point. That's cherry picking to another level. And if that isn't biased, I don't know what is.
In some cases, to get a digital ID or a green pass, you needed to have the 2 shots or the 3 shots. And remember how the mainstream media and the government vehemently condemned unvaccinated people for being irresponsible and spreading the disease. Well, this information suggests that they may have been better protected and less likely to spread it than some of the people that were criticising them.
For the sake of argument, let's say that natural immunity is better. Let's say magnitude's better than vaccinated immunity. In that case, you're still wrong, because in order to acquire natural adaptive immune responses, you still have to be infected first, which means you already went through a phase where you contracted and spread COVID. You've done your damage. It doesn't matter how much you're protected afterwards. When we talk about who's spreading or contracting the virus, the comparison shouldn't be between vaccinated individuals and individuals who have gotten a prior infection. It should be between vaccinated individuals and individuals who have not had an infection or vaccination before. And since efficacy rate is done in comparison to the baseline, the efficacy of that is essentially 0%. So no, in no universe is your statement correct whatsoever.
So doesn't that show you how irresponsible the corporate media and the government have been, not just in the message they were conveying, but the manner of the message, the social damage that was done, particularly now as the science suggests that they may have been wrong.
Don't ever even pretend science is on your side when you haven't even gone through the basic effort of reading the primary scientific paper that your claim is based on. Anyway, that was the first claim in the video he made. We might continue with a part 2 later on, but Russell pumps out so many garbage videos like this that there's just an ocean of content to pick out of. So if we don't respond to this specific video again, we'll do a different one from him in the future. Thank you to Fireshard, Alan Morton, Miss Fixit, and Edward Martin for their loyal support on Patreon. If you have a video suggestion, please let me know. See you next week.